"I think she's lost the woman in the Hermes scarf," murmured to her husband, not bothering to lower her voice, not bothering to look away. Someone should tell her the public terminal is back that way. The Diamond Medallion Club at JFK International Airport was by design a place that made certain people feel like they belonged to a different world entirely, and made everyone else feel like a mistake that needed correcting. The air was held at a precise 68 degrees, cool enough to justify the cashmere draped over shoulders that had never known a cold commute, warm enough that the leather club chairs never felt unwelcoming to the people who were supposed to sit in them. It smelled of bergamot and old money and the particular kind of silence that only exists when every surface has been chosen specifically to absorb the noise of the outside world. Zara Coleman sat in the corner chair closest to the floor-to-ceiling glass wall overlooking the tarmac, and she looked like someone had photoshopped her into the wrong picture. Her hoodie was charcoal gray and faded, the Caltech logo across the chest reduced to a ghost of itself after too many washes in too many dormitory machines. Her jeans were dark and unremarkable. Her sneakers were high tops that had once been white and were now the color of a city sidewalk. Her hair was pulled back in a practical puff, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones rested around her neck like a collar she'd forgotten to take off. She was 19 years old, and she looked to every single person in that lounge who glanced her way like someone's intern who had accidentally wandered through the wrong door. None of them looked at the backpack sitting between her feet on the polished marble floor, and none of them would have understood what they were looking at if they had. The bag contained a matte black laptop encrypted with military-grade security protocols worth $45,000 that Zara had built herself from components she'd sourced from 3 different countries. It also contained the only physical key in existence capable of authorizing the most sophisticated aviation software ever written, a system that was, at this exact moment, loaded into the navigation architecture of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, sitting on the tarmac 60 yards beyond the glass. A lounge attendant materialized beside her chair with the practiced smile of someone trained to mask confusion with hospitality. He set a glass of sparkling water with lime on the small table beside her and held out a printed boarding card in a leather sleeve, his eyebrows doing something subtle that his face was too disciplined to fully express. "Sparkling water with lime as requested," he said, "and boarding for Terrafly Flight 507 to London Heathrow will begin in 12 minutes. You have pre-boarding clearance, Ms. Coleman." "Thanks," Zara said, and her voice was soft and unhurried in a way that seemed to surprise him slightly, as though he'd been braced for something different. She took the glass without looking up from her phone. The message on the screen was from Raymond Okafor, Chief Technology Officer of Terrafly Airlines, and it had arrived 4 minutes ago with the particular urgency of a man who checked his phone every 30 seconds when something important was happening. "Zara Patch is loaded and ready for the transatlantic test. Board is watching this flight personally. If the fuel optimization holds at cruise altitude, we're looking at 12% savings fleet-wide. Everything is riding on today. Don't let any of the noise distract you." She typed back quickly, her thumbs moving with the automatic speed of someone who spent more time communicating through code than conversation. "Code is solid. I just need to be on the plane and plug in the key before the 45-minute window closes after wheels up. That's all. Stop worrying, Raymond." She set the phone down and picked up the water glass and drank half of it in one long pull because she was running on 52 hours of near-continuous work, and her body had stopped asking for sleep and started simply demanding fuel in whatever form it could get. There was a particular quality to the exhaustion she was carrying. Not the soft heaviness of tiredness, but the electric, brittle feeling of a mind that had been pushed past its limits and was now running on something that wasn't quite energy and wasn't quite will, but was somewhere in between. She rolled her neck slowly, heard it crack in 3 places, and looked out through the glass at the tarmac below. The 787 was out there, gleaming silver and blue in the flat morning light, ground crew moving around it with the particular choreography of a pre-flight inspection, and even from up here she could see the geometry of the engines, The curve of the nacelles, the specific angle of the winglets that her software had been calibrated to work in concert with. She had spent 18 months on the aerodynamic modeling alone. She knew that plane the way some people know a face. For the first time all morning, something in her shoulders released just slightly, and she almost smiled. Then she saw the man at the podium. She almost missed him entirely, because her eyes were drawn first to a little girl standing at the window of the main terminal corridor, just visible through the lounge's glass partition wall. Maybe 9 or 10 years old, face pressed flat against the glass, breath fogging it, watching the planes with an intensity of longing that Zara recognized in her bones before she recognized it in her mind. She had been that girl. Exactly that girl. Englewood on Chicago's South Side was not a neighborhood that raised its children on the expectation that the sky was within reach. It raised them instead on a particular combination of love and pragmatism. The understanding that the world had rules, that the rules were not written for people who looked like you, and that surviving within them required a specific kind of intelligence that no one gave out awards for. Zara had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment on a street where the corner store had bulletproof glass at the register and the elementary school had metal detectors at the door, and both of these facts were considered as unremarkable as the weather. Her mother, Diane Coleman, worked nights at Northwestern Memorial 3 12-hour shifts a week as a licensed practical nurse, coming home at 6 in the morning with her scrubs still carrying the antiseptic smell of the ICU. And she would stop in the kitchen before she went to bed and check Zara's homework from the night before, leaving small notes in the margins in her neat, looping handwriting. "Good work, baby," or "check your math here," or sometimes just a small star drawn in red ink beside something that had impressed her. There was no moment when someone discovered Zara Coleman and recognized her genius and pointed her toward the stars. That was not the story. The story was quieter and harder and more honest than that. The story was a girl who found a box of donated programming books at the Chicago Public Library's Englewood branch when she was 11, who checked out every single one who read them at the kitchen table after her mother left for work, and kept reading until 2 in the morning because the apartment was quiet then and the ideas were loud. Who got her first real computer from a community donation program when she was 12 and immediately began taking it apart to understand how it worked. Who taught herself Python, then C++, then assembly language from tutorials she watched on a screen with a cracked corner, because she'd dropped it once and couldn't afford to fix it. She was 14 when she found the vulnerability in Terrafly's public-facing fuel management documentation. She wasn't looking for it intentionally. She had been reading every piece of publicly available technical literature she could find about commercial aviation systems, which was a deep obsession she had developed after reading a book about the Gimli glider incident, a 1983 case where a Boeing 767 ran out of fuel mid-flight due to a unit conversion error, and she found the vulnerability the way you find a loose thread by pulling on something that seemed interesting and watching the whole seam come undone. She wrote a 12-page report documenting the flaw and emailed it to Terrafly's engineering department using an address she found buried in a 3-year-old regulatory filing, not expecting anything really, just feeling that it was the right thing to do. Raymond Okafor had called her 3 days later. He'd assumed the email was from a professional security researcher, maybe a grad student. The silence that followed when she told him she was 14 and in 8th grade at Hope Academy on West 63rd Street was long enough that she'd checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Caltech came 2 years after that full scholarship, and Zara had arrived with 2 bags and the laptop she'd rebuilt from parts and a wariness about the environment that turned out to be fully justified because being the youngest student and one of the only black women in the aerospace engineering program was exactly as exhausting as she'd anticipated. And the exhaustion was of a very specific kind, not the exhaustion of not being smart enough, which she never felt, but the exhaustion of having to prove you were smart enough before you were allowed to simply be in the room. She had left after her 2nd year, not because she'd failed at anything, but because Raymond had called again with a contract offer. Senior Systems Architect, direct hire, no internship, no probationary period. And because what TerraFly was building required someone who could think about aviation software the way it had never been thought about before, and Raymond believed and Zara believed that she was that person. Terramax had taken her 3 years to build. 3 years of architecture design and stress testing and failure modeling, and the kind of deep solitary coding work that meant she regularly lost track of days and frequently forgot to eat and once went 60 hours without sleeping because she was chasing a bug in the fuel optimization algorithm that turned out to be a single misplaced semicolon. The system connected a plane's navigation, fuel management, and engine performance into a single integrated intelligence linked to a central cloud server that allowed real-time optimization across an entire fleet. It was without exaggeration the most sophisticated piece of aviation software in commercial history. But it required a key, a physical key biometrically locked to Zara's fingerprint that had to be plugged into the plane's onboard server within 45 minutes of wheels up on its inaugural flight to authorize the system's first live operation and open the gateway between the aircraft and the central server. If the key wasn't inserted in time, Terramax would interpret the silence as evidence that the aircraft had been compromised, stolen, hijacked, attacked, and it would initiate Protocol Zero. She had built Protocol Zero herself. She knew exactly what it would do. She had not, at the time of building it, imagined a scenario where she would be prevented from getting on the plane. Zara set the water glass down and began gathering her things with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to move through airports, the way water moves through a complex system of pipes, taking the path of least resistance, conserving energy, arriving where she needed to be without drama. She knew how she looked. She had always known how she looked, and she had long since made peace with the gap between what people saw when they looked at her and what she actually was not, because the gap didn't matter. It mattered enormously, and the cost of crossing it every single day was something she paid in a currency that didn't have a name, but because letting it stop her was a luxury she had never been able to afford and had never wanted to afford. She had chosen the hoodie this morning because it was comfortable and familiar because she'd been coding in it for the past 2 days and changing felt like an interruption to a process that wasn't finished yet, and because some stubborn part of her believed that she should not have to perform respectability in order to be treated with basic human dignity. Her mother had told her that once, sitting at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, still in her nursing scrubs, speaking with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned something expensive and wanted to make sure her daughter got the lesson at a discount. You are not responsible for what people assume about you. You are only responsible for who you actually are. The lounge attendant reappeared as Zara shouldered her backpack this time with a slightly different quality to his smile, something that might have been genuine. "Can we arrange a car for you in London, Ms. Coleman?" he asked. Sometimes our executive guests prefer to have ground transportation confirmed before departure. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." She walked through the lounge and out into the terminal corridor, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The cushioned quiet of the Diamond Club replaced by the particular acoustic texture of a major international airport at 7:45 in the morning, the overlapping announcements and rolling luggage, and the 1,000 small collisions of thousands of lives moving in parallel. She walked through it with her headphones still around her neck and her mind already at 30,000 feet, already thinking about the sequence she would run once she was seated. The precise steps of the key insertion protocol she had rehearsed in her head so many times that she could perform them in her sleep. The corridor curved and opened, and she could see Gate B22 ahead, and that was when she heard it, the low, powerful rumble of the 787's engines doing their pre-departure checks. A sound that moved through the floor and up through the soles of her sneakers and into her chest like a second heartbeat. And it made her smile in spite of everything, because that sound was the sound of her work made real 3 years of late nights and lost weekends, and stubborn, obsessive problem-solving, translated into something that could lift 300 people off the ground and carry them across an ocean. The smile lasted approximately 4 seconds, Because at the podium of Gate B-22, standing with his feet planted wide and his four-striped epaulets catching the morning light, was a man whose whole posture said, "I own this space in a language that needed no translation." And even from 30 feet away, even before he turned his head, even before he saw her, Zara felt something shift in the air between them. The specific, familiar atmospheric pressure change that preceded a certain kind of encounter. She had felt it before. She knew what it meant. She kept walking anyway because stopping was never an option she gave herself. Captain Blake Harrow was 57 years old, and he wore those years the way a man wears a tailored suit, not as evidence of time passing, but as evidence of status accrued each line on his face, a credential, each gray thread in his platinum blonde hair, a citation. He was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, and he stood at podiums the way other men sit at thrones with the absolute physical certainty of someone who has never seriously been told that a space was not his. He had been talking to First Officer Devon Park for the past 10 minutes or more. Accurately, he had been talking at Devon Park, who was young and precise, and was currently holding a tablet loaded with the Terramax pre-flight documentation, and was giving it the careful attention it deserved while simultaneously performing just enough nodding and eye contact to maintain the appearance of listening to Harrow's extended meditation on the superiority of manual flying. The problem with this whole program, Harrow was saying, with the conviction of a man delivering a verdict rather than an opinion, is that it takes the skill out of it. 30 years ago, if your fuel management system failed, you flew the plane. You knew the plane. You felt the plane. Now they want you to babysit a machine that was supposedly designed by somebody who's never even been inside a cockpit. Devon kept his eyes on the tablet. He had heard several versions of this speech. He knew better than to respond to it directly because responding to it directly led to longer versions of the same speech delivered with increasing volume. Whoever wrote this software, Harrow continued waving a hand at the gate area in the general direction of the 787 outside, is going to cost someone their life one day. You can't replace 30 years of experience with an algorithm. It's not possible. I don't care what Raymond Okafor says. I don't care what the board says. Devon had in fact read Zara Coleman's complete engineering documentation the previous week. All 412 pages of it, plus the supplementary technical appendices, and he had understood it well enough to know that it was not the work of someone who had never thought seriously about aviation. It was the work of someone who had thought about almost nothing else for 3 years. Someone who had mapped failure modes that Harrow's 30 years of experience hadn't encountered because they were failure modes that could only exist in a world with this level of integrated technology. But Devon was 29 years old and 3 months into his assignment as Harrow's first officer, and he was still learning which battles were worth having and which ones needed to be survived quietly. He was still thinking about this when he saw Zara Coleman coming down the terminal corridor. He recognized her immediately from the photo in her contractor file, which he had reviewed as part of his standard pre-flight briefing. The file had been explicit critical technical personnel, S1 executive clearance, physical presence required on board for Terramax system authorization. Do not offload under any circumstances. He watched her approach the priority boarding lane, and he felt the shape of the next few minutes assembling themselves in his mind with a clarity that was almost physical, like watching weather roll in from a distance and knowing you're standing in its path. Harrow had gone quiet. Devon looked up from the tablet and saw that Harrow had turned toward the gate area and was watching Zara walk toward them with an expression that didn't yet know it was about to become a problem. Devon could see what Harrow was seeing, a young black woman in a faded hoodie and beat-up sneakers backpack on her shoulders, looking for all the world like someone who was about to be politely redirected. Devon could also see what Harrow was not seeing, the S1 clearance code on his own gate manifest the 7-word notation in bold text at the top of her file entry and the countdown timer on the Terramax dashboard showing that they had exactly 49 minutes from wheels up before Protocol 0 became inevitable. He opened his mouth. Harrow stepped away from the podium. Devon closed his mouth. There was a version of Blake Harrow's life in which he was simply a man who had worked very hard and gotten very good at something genuinely difficult, and that version was true, and it deserved its acknowledgement before anything else did. He had started flying at 22 in a Cessna 172 over the flat agricultural geometry of central Ohio, and the moment the wheels left the ground on his first solo flight, he had felt something click into place inside him that had never clicked out again. A sense of fundamental rightness of being exactly where physics and purpose and his own particular configuration of gifts had always been pointing him. He was a natural aviator in the way that some people are natural swimmers or natural mathematicians, not because it was effortless, but because the effort felt like the right kind of effort, the kind that sharpens rather than depletes. He had spent the next 3 decades learning the sky with an almost monastic dedication. He had flown small regionals and then mid-sized domestics, and then long-haul transatlantic routes for Terrafly, accumulating hours and ratings and commendations, with the steady patience of a man who understood that excellence in his field was a thing that had to be built year by year, flight by flight, like a wall laid one careful brick at a time. He had been genuinely good. He had been for a long period excellent. There were pilots who flew with him in his 40s who described him as the kind of captain you wanted in the seat when things went sideways, unflappable, technically precise, the sort of person whose calmness was genuinely contagious rather than performed. But there was another version of Blake Harrow's story, one that had been running parallel to the first for most of his career, and had only recently begun to dominate. And that version was about what happens to a man who has built his entire identity around a particular kind of mastery, when the world begins to change in ways that threaten to make that mastery beside the point. Terrafly's announcement of the TerraMax program had landed on Harrow like a diagnosis he hadn't been expecting and didn't intend to accept. Not because the technology was necessarily bad, he wouldn't have admitted it then, but there was a part of him that understood in the abstract that fuel optimization software and integrated navigation systems were the future of commercial aviation. But because of what the program represented and what it implied about the future value of everything he had spent 30 years building, if a computer could fly the plane better than he could, then what were his 30 years worth? And when he found out who had written the computer, not a team of senior engineers at Boeing or Airbus or one of the established defense contractors, but a 19-year-old girl from Chicago's South Side who had dropped out of college and had never logged a single hour of flight time. Something in him had moved from professional skepticism to something uglier and less reasonable, something he didn't examine too closely because examining it would have required admitting what it was. He told himself it was about standards. He told himself it was about safety. He told himself that 20 years of experience entitled him to look at a situation and render a judgment that his gut instinct was a calibrated instrument finely tuned by decades of real-world conditions, and that the idea of trusting the navigation of a multi-million-dollar aircraft full of human beings to software written by someone who looked like she should be studying for a calc exam was not prejudice, it was professionalism. He was wrong about all of that. But he was not yet at a place in his life where he could see that he was wrong, and the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was about to cost him everything. The mind does its most dangerous work in the space before a thought becomes a word in the fraction of a second when incoming information is being sorted into categories, and the sorting happens faster than consciousness can monitor it. And the categories have been shaped by things the conscious mind has never examined. Blake Harrow looked at Zara Coleman walking toward him, and his mind completed its assessment in less time than it took him to draw a breath. Hoodie, sneakers, young, black, backpack, priority lane, S1 clearance. The last item didn't fit the others. His mind resolved the contradiction the way it always resolved contradictions that didn't suit the framework by dismissing the anomaly rather than reconsidering the framework. There was a mistake. There was a mix-up. There was a system error or a fraudulent booking or some kind of affirmative action accommodation that someone had coded into the manifest without thinking about what it actually meant to put a passenger like this in the first row of a flagship inaugural flight. He was already stepping away from the podium before he had consciously decided to do it. Devon Park saw him move and felt the specific dread of someone watching a situation develop that they do not have the standing to stop. He had read the file. He had read every word of the file, including the 7-word notation in bold text at the top of Zara Coleman's entry, the one that said, "Do not offload under any circumstances." He had also read enough of her engineering documentation to understand what the 45-minute handshake window meant and what happened if it was missed. He was 29 years old. He was 3 months into his first assignment as a long-haul first officer. He had watched Harrow dismiss his attempts to redirect the pre-flight conversation twice already this morning, both times, with a kind of offhand authority that made clear that disagreement was not a welcome feature of their working relationship. Devon looked at the countdown timer on the Terramax dashboard. He looked at Zara Coleman, who was now 12 feet away and had not yet seen Harrow moving to intercept her. He looked at Harrow, who was crossing the gate area with the settled certainty of someone performing a duty rather than making a mistake. Devon opened his mouth and said "Captain," in a voice that came out quieter than he intended, and Harrow made a small dismissive gesture without turning around the way you'd wave away a fly, and that was that. Devon looked back at the tablet. The bold text was still there. "Do not offload under any circumstances." He read it one more time, as if reading it again might somehow project it backward through time to a place where it could do some good. It couldn't. The moment had already passed. Devon Park had grown up wanting to fly because his grandmother had told him when he was 7 years old, and they were sitting on her porch in Pasadena, watching a plane draw a white line across the blue sky, that the people who flew those planes were the people the world trusted most, and that being trusted was the best thing a person could aspire to. He still believed that. He believed it in a way that had survived flight school and the regional grind and the particular cultural atmosphere of a commercial cockpit, which was, for all its professionalism, not entirely without its own versions of the hierarchies and blind spots that existed everywhere else in the world. He believed it on the days when he walked onto a flight deck and the captain looked at him with that fraction of a second of recalibration, the tiny, visible adjustment that told him he was not quite what had been expected, and he processed that adjustment and filed it away and did his job because his job was what he was there to do, and he was very good at it. He had known Harrow was going to be difficult before they ever met. The file was comprehensive if you knew how to read it. 30 years of exceptional performance metrics threaded through with a recurring note about communication challenges, with new protocols and resistance to technology integration. That was in the particular bureaucratic language of airline HR documentation, a polite way of describing a man who had been fighting the future for about a decade and was losing ground faster than he realized. But Devon had also known that Harrow was genuinely skilled, and he had gone into the assignment prepared to learn from the skill while managing the difficulty, which was a calculation he made with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been making it his whole life. What he hadn't been fully prepared for was the moment when Harrow's difficulty would stop being an abstract professional challenge and would start being a specific, concrete, consequential problem with a name and a face and a countdown timer attached to it. He had read Zara Coleman's file with the same thoroughness he brought to every pre-flight briefing, and what he had found in those pages had done something unusual to him. It had made him feel something that was adjacent to awe, which was not an emotion he was accustomed to experiencing in a professional context. Not because of her age, though her age was extraordinary, but because of the quality of the thinking on display in her documentation, the way she had approached problems that the established engineers had been circling for years and had simply solved them cleanly and completely by coming at them from a direction that nobody else had thought to try. She had written in the preamble to the Terramax architecture document in language that was unusually plain for a technical specification that she had designed the system to make flying safer. Not by replacing human judgment, but by giving human judgment better information to work with. That the goal was not automation for its own sake, but the creation of a partnership between the pilot's experience and the system's processing capacity that neither could achieve alone. Devon had read that paragraph 3 times. He was thinking about it now as he stood at the gate podium and watched Harrow position himself in front of Zara Coleman, with the physical language of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. And the particular helplessness Devon felt in that moment was not the helplessness of someone who didn't know what was right, but of someone who understood exactly what was right and also understood with a precision that was its own kind of pain. Exactly how much standing he had to act on that understanding. 3 months. He had been in this assignment for 3 months. The captain was the authority in a commercial cockpit in a way that was not metaphorical. It was regulatory, structural, built into the foundations of how aviation operated, and the mechanisms for challenging that authority existed on paper in a way that they did not always exist in practice, especially when you were 3 months in and the captain had 30 years and the culture of the cockpit was what it was. Devon looked at the countdown timer on his tablet. 47 minutes from wheels up. He looked at the notes field on Zara's manifest entry, the bold text he had been looking at all morning. He looked at Harrow's back. He made a choice. He was not in that moment proud of it, and he would not be proud of it later, and the weight of it would sit with him for a very long time afterward, in a way that taught him something important about the cost of silence and about the things you tell yourself to justify the choices you make when acting on what you know is right carries a price you're not sure you can pay. He looked back at his tablet. He said nothing, and the gate area held its breath. Zara reached the priority boarding lane and held out her boarding pass to the gate agent, a woman whose name badge read Sarah Ewan, and whose expression had the specific quality of someone trying to complete a straightforward task while a weather system developed directly to her left. The scanner beeped. Sarah's screen updated. Everything was exactly as it should be. Name confirmed, seat 1. A confirmed, S1 clearance, confirmed, pre-board authorization confirmed, and Sarah was just beginning to reach for the leather sleeve to return the boarding pass when a shadow fell across the podium. Hold on. The voice was the voice of someone who expected the world to stop when he spoke to it, and the world at gate B22 obliged because it generally did. Zara looked up. Blake Harrow was standing between her and the jet bridge door with his feet planted at shoulder width and his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular confidence of a man who was certain he was performing a service rather than causing a harm. He was taller than she'd expected. He looked her up and down in a single sweep the way a customs agent looks at a suitcase he's already decided to open, and then he looked at Sarah Ewan with an expression that said obviously. There's been a mix-up, he said, not to Zara, but to Sarah, as if Zara were an object whose misplacement was being discussed rather than a person whose boarding was being questioned. Run it again. Seat 1A is reserved for executive-level passengers and essential company personnel. She's cleared, Captain Sarah said, and her voice had a faint tremor in it that she was working to control. Seat 1. Zara Coleman. Everything checks out. I have the correct boarding pass, Zara said, and her voice was even and clear in a way that cost her something to maintain, because she had been awake for 52 hours and she was exhausted, and she knew what this was, and knowing what it was did not make it any less of a drain. She held the boarding pass out so Harrow could see it. My name is Zara Coleman. I'm the lead systems architect for the Terramax integration. I need to board now. Harrow took the boarding pass out of her hand without asking, the way someone takes a document they've already decided to scrutinize. And he looked at it, and specifically he looked at the clearance code printed in the upper right corner, the 2 characters that sat above the standard ticket information S1. something shifted in his expression. Not softened. Nothing about Harrow softened in that moment, but recalculated the way a person recalculates when they encounter a fact that doesn't fit their assumption, and decide the fact must be wrong. S1, he said, and his tone made it sound like a suspicious finding rather than a confirmation. That's board-level clearance. He looked at Zara with a new quality of attention, the attention of someone assembling a theory. Where did you get this? I earned it, Zara said. Around them, the passengers who had been gathering in the priority lane were registering the situation with varying degrees of attention and response. Two men in business suits were exchanging glances. A woman in her 40s with a rolling carry-on had her phone out, angled in a way that suggested it was no longer being used for reading. A young man near the back of the line had gone very still. Sarah Ewan was looking at her screen, then at Harrow, then at her screen again, with the expression of someone who knows the correct answer and also knows that knowing the correct answer is not going to be sufficient. Devon Park stood at the podium and looked at his tablet and did not look up. Captain Sarah said carefully, Her file notation says I'll handle this, Soraya Harrow said, using her name in a way that was meant to be reassuring but functioned as a silencing. And then he looked back at Zara, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had already written the ending to this story and was simply narrating toward it. There was a specific kind of exhaustion that Zara Coleman had been managing since she was approximately 11 years old, and it had nothing to do with sleep deprivation and everything to do with the ongoing labor of existing in spaces that had been built at every level for someone else, and having to expend energy every single day on the work of just being there without apologizing for it. She had learned over years of practice that the most effective response to this particular kind of attack was not anger, because anger, even righteous anger, even anger with every justification in the world behind it, would be used against her. And it was not compliance, because compliance, even strategic compliance, had a way of becoming permanent if you weren't careful, but a very specific form of calm that she thought of privately as building the room. The act of maintaining your own dignity so completely and so visibly that anyone watching could see exactly who was doing what to whom. She stood straight. She kept her voice level. She stated facts. My name is Zara Coleman, she said. I am the lead systems architect and principal engineer for the Terramax software integration on this aircraft. I hold an S1 executive clearance granted by Terrafly's board of directors. I have a confirmed first-class ticket for Seat 1A on this flight, which is the only flight today on which the Terramax system's inaugural handshake protocol can be completed. If I do not board this aircraft, there will be a technical consequence that will affect not just this flight, but every Terrafly aircraft currently running Terramax. I am telling you this as a statement of fact, not a negotiation. Harrow looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just heard something technically impressive and completely unpersuasive. Systems architect, he said, and he repeated it in the tone of someone reading a punchline. You. He glanced at the waiting passengers with the specific audience-seeking look of someone who wants to share a joke. She's a systems architect, folks. A few people looked away. A few didn't. Captain. Devon Park's voice came from the podium, quiet and careful, and Harrow turned his head just slightly, not enough to fully acknowledge it, but enough to indicate he'd heard. The file notation on Ms. Coleman's entry is, I said I'd handle it, Devon. The words were mild and absolute at the same time, and Devon went quiet. Harrow turned back to Zara and delivered the line that had been building in him since the moment he'd seen her coming down the corridor. The line that expressed the thing he'd been thinking since he first heard about the Terramax program, and who had written it. The line that came from the deepest place in him, where the fear about obsolescence and the assumptions about belonging and the 30 years of accumulated authority had all been pressed together under pressure until they had compressed into something hard and sharp and ugly. Listen, he said, leaning forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that it felt almost confidential. almost like he was doing her a favor. "I don't know what kind of lottery you won or what box somebody needed to check to put you on this manifest, but I am the captain of this vessel, and I am the one who decides who gets on this plane. And my job is to protect these passengers. And my gut tells me that a teenager in a hoodie with an S1 clearance she didn't earn is not the person I want in the first row of my aircraft." "I did earn it," Zara said quietly. "Walk away," he said. "Find a seat in the departure area. We'll sort out the paperwork issue from London." At the back of the priority lane, the woman with the phone had stopped pretending she wasn't recording. An older man near the front, silver-haired, wearing a well-cut coat, cleared his throat and said, "I think there might be a misunderstanding here in the tone of someone who was deeply uncomfortable and felt that someone should say something, and Harrow turned to him with the full force of 30 years of practiced authority and said, 'Sir, this is a security matter. I'd ask you to step back, please.' And the older man stepped back and the gate area went quiet again, in that particular way where everyone has an opinion and no one has the power." Zara stood in the silence. She was very still and very straight, and her face was composed in the way a face is composed when it has had a great deal of practice at this specific composition. Inside, she was calculating. "Captain Montgomery," she said, and caught herself because that wasn't his name, and the slip told her something about how tired she was, and she reset. "Captain Harrow, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information rather than a challenge, because it is information, and it is important." Harrow crossed his arms and waited with the expression of someone humoring a delay. "If this aircraft departs without me on board, the Terramax system will reach its handshake window 45 minutes after wheels up without receiving an authorized key signal. When that happens, the system will initiate Protocol 0. That means the aircraft's navigation and throttle will be moved to a restricted flight envelope. It means the system will broadcast a compromise alert to the central server. And it means that every other Terrafly aircraft currently running Terramax will receive a quarantine signal from that central server." She paused. "That is not a prediction. That is not a warning. That is a technical description of what the software I built will do. I am telling you because I believe you should have complete information before you make a decision." The gate area was very quiet. Harrow looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not entirely anticipated. He laughed. Not a surprised laugh or an uncertain laugh, but a full performative laugh pitched to Carrie, designed to communicate to everyone within earshot that what he had just heard was not a technical briefing but a performance of some kind. "She has the keys to the plane," he announced to the waiting area in general, spreading his hands like a man sharing good news. "Somebody get this girl a cape." He turned to Sarah Ewan, and his voice dropped back to the register of a man issuing instructions. "Close the jet bridge. Remove her from the manifest. I'm not taking this flight up with a security risk in the first row. If she's who she says she is, we'll sort it out from London." "Captain, I really," Sarah began. "Sarah, one word. Final." Zara reached into her pocket and took out her phone. She typed 2 words to Raymond Okafor and sent them. Then she put the phone away and looked at Harrow one last time, and the look she gave him was not angry and it was not pleading. It was the look of someone who has done everything within their power to prevent a consequence and has reached the limit of that power and now must simply stand in the knowledge of what comes next. 2 TSA officers materialized at the edges of the gate area with the particular timing that suggested they had been observing from nearby for some time. They were big men, tired-looking, and they did what people in positions of official authority almost always do when faced with an ambiguous situation between a person in a uniform they recognize and a person who looks out of place. They resolved the ambiguity in favor of the uniform. Miss one of them said, moving to stand beside her, "You need to come with us, please." Zara didn't argue. There was nothing more to argue. She turned and began walking with them, and she didn't look back at the gate, and she didn't look at Devon Park, who was standing at the podium reading the words, "Do not offload under any circumstances," for what felt like the 10th time, and she didn't look at the passengers who watched her go, or at Harrow, who adjusted his cap with one hand and straightened to his full height. She did look once at the jet bridge door. Then she looked away. The Port Authority security holding room at JFK was not a place designed for waiting comfortably, which Zara supposed was the point, since the people held here were generally either very anxious or very guilty, and neither state was meant to be soothed. The chair was molded plastic, the color of old teeth. The table was metal cold to the touch, even through her sleeves. The fluorescent light above her hummed at a frequency that she recognized in some remote, still functional part of her brain as approximately 60 hertz, which was the standard for North American electrical systems, which was a fact she was clinging to because it was a fact, and facts were still working even when everything else wasn't. Through the narrow window, set high in the exterior wall, she could see a slice of tarmac, and beyond it the distant geometry of the runway. And she was watching through that window when the Terrafly 787, with her software in its navigation system and her key in the overhead bin of seat 1, executed a slow, deliberate right turn at the end of the taxiway and aligned itself with the runway centerline. Detective Marcus Tran sat across from her with a yellow legal pad and a pen he kept clicking with the automatic rhythm of someone trying to stay awake. He was a man in his early 50s who wore the particular expression of someone who has seen enough strange things that new strange things no longer surprised him but still required documentation. He had been asking her in a patient and not unkind way to explain again why she had been agitated at the gate, why she had said things about the plane being unable to fly without her, and whether she had any documentation to support her claim of employment with Terrafly Airlines. Zara answered his questions in the same even tone she used for everything, and she was aware in some distant part of her mind that she was performing a version of calm that she did not fully feel, because underneath it she was very tired and very angry, and there was a specific kind of grief that came with being treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be listened to. A grief she had been living with for long enough that she knew how to carry it without it showing on her face. Her phone rang. Raymond Okafor. She looked at the phone. She looked at Detective Tran, who made a small gesture indicating she could take the call. She answered. Zara. Raymond's voice was tight in the way voices get when someone is trying to manage a situation that is already past the point of management. Tell me you're on the plane. I'm in security holding, she said. Harrow pulled me off the manifest. He called me a security risk. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she could hear in the background the ambient sound of Terrafly's operations center in Dallas, the controlled hum of a room full of screens and people, and the particular tension of a system being monitored very carefully. I can call the tower, Raymond said finally. I can get a hold order on the flight right now. I have the authority. No, Zara said. Zara. No. She kept her voice very steady. If you stop the flight from the ground, this becomes a system malfunction story. Harrow spends the next year telling everyone that Terramax grounded a plane because of a glitch, and he gets to be the hero who was right to be skeptical, and nothing changes. She paused. Let the flight go, Raymond. Let the system do what the system does. Let the consequences be in the air where everyone can see them. She was aware as she said it that this was not the only reason. The other reason was less rational and more honest, and it was this: she was 22 hours past the limit of her patience, and she was sitting in a room that smelled of institutional cleaner because a man with a platinum blonde haircut and 4 gold stripes on his shoulder had looked at her and decided she wasn't real, and there was a part of her that was tired enough and human enough to want the weight of that decision to land exactly where it belonged. She didn't say that part out loud. The fleet, Raymond said quietly. The cascading lockout if the flagship triggers Protocol 0 while linked to the live network, I know, she said. I designed it. I can fix it remotely if I have my laptop and a hardline connection. I just need someone to get me out of this room." She looked at Detective Tran, who was no longer clicking his pen and was watching her with an expression that had shifted from patient documentation to something more attentive. Through the high window, the 787 had turned onto the runway, and as she watched, its engines spooled up to the particular brightness of a sound that could not be mistaken for anything else, and the plane began to move and accelerate, and then lift the nose rising with a grace that made no sense given the weight involved. And in seconds it was climbing and shrinking, and then it was just a shape against the pale morning sky, and then it was gone. Zara watched the empty sky for a moment. Then she turned back to Detective Tran and said, "I'm going to need my laptop, and I'm going to need to leave this room. How quickly can we make that happen?" At 32,000 feet over the North Atlantic, the world looked exactly the way Blake Harrow believed the world should look, orderly and vast and very far below, with him above it. The 787 had climbed out of JFK beautifully exactly as he had known it would, because beautiful takeoffs were something he delivered reliably and had been delivering for 3 decades, and now the aircraft was trimmed and steady at cruise altitude, with the autopilot engaged and the Atlantic spreading out beneath them like something vast and indifferent. And the morning light through the cockpit windows was doing the specific thing it did at this altitude, gold and clean and unfiltered by the atmospheric haze that muddied everything below 25,000 feet. "Look at that," Harrow said, settling back in his seat with the particular satisfaction of a man arriving somewhere he belongs. "You don't get that from the ground." Devon Park was looking at his instruments. He had been looking at his instruments with great concentration since they had climbed through 10,000 feet, and the concentration was not entirely about the instruments. In the corner of the Terramax display panel, the large LCD screen that had replaced the old analog gauges and that Harrow regarded with the same fondness he might have regarded an uninvited guest, a small amber indicator had been cycling quietly since approximately 7 minutes after takeoff. Devon had noticed it immediately. He had been calculating since he noticed it how to address it in a way that would result in a productive response from the man in the left seat. He had not yet identified such a way. "She's drinking a little heavy on the fuel side," Harrow observed, glancing at the fuel flow gauge, "but she's smooth. Best air I've felt in months, actually." He reached forward and touched the yoke lightly, the way someone touches something they love. "You feel that she wants to fly. The machine wants to fly. That's something no algorithm is going to replicate." Captain Devon said carefully, "There's an indicator on the Terramax panel." Harrow glanced at it. "It'll clear. It's been cycling for Devon." The tone was not unkind, which was almost worse than if it had been. "I know you're fresh, and the training program puts a lot of emphasis on the new systems, and I respect that I do. But I have been flying this route since before you were in secondary school, and I have seen more caution lights and advisory indicators and automated warnings than I can count, and 95% of them are the system being overcautious because the system was designed by people who don't trust pilots." He turned back to the view through the windshield. "I trust the plane. I trust my hands. We're fine." Devon looked at the Terramax display. The amber indicator had shifted. It was now red. In the lower right corner of the screen, in text that was small but very clear against the dark background, it read, "Handshake required. Key authorization window 1247 remaining." Devon looked at the text. He looked at Harrow, who was looking at the horizon. He looked back at the text. 12 minutes and 47 seconds. He thought about Zara Coleman sitting in a security holding room at JFK because Blake Harrow had looked at her and decided in less time than it takes to draw a breath that she couldn't be what she said she was. He thought about the 412 pages of engineering documentation he had read, and the paragraph about the partnership between human judgment and system intelligence, and the 7-word notation in bold text on her manifest entry that Harrow had never read. He thought about what happened at Zero. He opened his mouth. "Captain, he said I think we should." But Harrow was pointing at something outside the window and saying something about the cloud formation to the south, and the moment passed, and Devon sat with the knowledge of what was coming and the terrible leaden feeling of a man watching a clock run down. The sound that Protocol Zero made when it initiated was not dramatic, and that was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. A single clean-tone musical, almost like a tuning fork being struck, followed by a silence in the cockpit. Avionics that felt different from ordinary silence, because it was the silence of systems that had been speaking to each other every millisecond, suddenly stopping. Then the main display screen turned red. Not orange, not amber, not the cautionary yellow of a system advisory. Red full and solid like a stop sign, and across it, in white text that was large enough that there was absolutely no possibility of misreading it. Protocol Zero initiated. Handshake authorization expired. Switching to restricted flight envelope. What in the Harrow leaned forward, his expression cycling from confusion to irritation to something that was trying not to become concern. "Clear it. Enter the override." "I'm trying," Devon said already on the keyboard. "Override requires an authorization code that use mine. Alpha 739er. Devon typed it. The screen displayed authorization denied. Architectural key required. Harrow grabbed the keyboard himself and typed the code again harder, as if the pressure of the keystrokes would change the response. It didn't. The first physical sensation came approximately 8 seconds after the screen went red. The throttle levers, which had been set to the precise cruise position, began to move backward of their own accord slowly and smoothly, and with a mechanical inevitability that was genuinely disturbing. The way things that are supposed to respond to human input, but aren't responding to human input, become disturbing. Harrow grabbed the levers. They continued moving backward anyway, not violently, but with the gentle, implacable force of a system following its own instructions. "Engines are rolling back," Devon said, reading the gauges with the focused calm of someone who is using professionalism as a container for panic. "N1 coming back to 70%. Thrust is being limited." Harrow shoved the levers forward with both hands, and the physical effort of a man who has been flying manually for 30 years and believes that his hands are enough. The levers didn't move past the detent point. It was as if an invisible bar had been placed across the throttle quadrant, not with force, but with a quiet, absolute certainty. "Push past it," Harrow said. "I can't," Devon said. "The system is overriding manual input on the throttle. The flight management computer is restricting engine output." The aircraft began to descend. It was not a dive, and it was not turbulence, and it was not anything that the flight attendants in the back would be able to identify as mechanical failure. At least, not yet. It was a slow, deliberate loss of altitude, a few hundred feet per minute. The calculated drift of a system that had concluded it could not maintain cruise altitude on restricted thrust, and was adjusting the flight envelope accordingly, finding the altitude at which the aircraft could maintain stable flight with the engines limited, which was approximately 10,000 feet, rather than 32,000. "We're descending," Harrow said, and his voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. "Why are we descending? I didn't tell it to descend. The system thinks the aircraft has been compromised," Devon said, and his voice was steady in the way that voices get steady when the person speaking has spent a long time preparing to say something that was going to be hard to say. "It thinks the pilots have been neutralized. It's implementing the hostile takeover protocol limiting thrust so the aircraft can't be used as a weapon, bringing it to a holding altitude, preparing to squawk the hijack code to ATC." Harrow stared at his first officer. The color had begun to leave his face in the way color leaves a face when the body is redirecting resources to processes it considers more urgent. "I am not a hijacker," he said. "I know," Devon said. "But the system doesn't know that. because the key that would have told it that was in the overhead bin of seat 1A. He paused for exactly 1 second. The key that belonged to the engineer you pulled off the manifest this morning. The cockpit radio crackled with the tense voice of their ATC controller asking Flight 507 to confirm altitude and heading, and Harrow looked at the transponder panel and saw the number that was now cycling in the squawk field. 7,500, the universal code for aircraft hijack, and the full understanding of what he had done descended on him the same way the aircraft was descending not all at once, but in a slow and absolute and unstoppable way. In TerraFly's Operations Center in Dallas, the moment that Flight 507's icon on the main board turned from green to red was the moment that Raymond Okafor had been dreading and calculating and trying to prevent since he'd received Zara's 2-word text 4 hours earlier, and the dread was not lessened by the fact that he had seen it coming. The Operations Center was a large room designed to manage complexity at scale with a curved wall of screens showing the global TerraFly network and a floor of workstations staffed by dispatchers and controllers and systems monitors who were at any given moment tracking the position, fuel state, weather exposure, and operational status of 147 aircraft on routes covering 62 countries. It was the kind of room that was built to handle crises, and the people who worked in it were the kind of people who had been trained to treat a crisis as a problem with a solution rather than a problem with a weight. But what happened in the 7 minutes following Flight 507's Protocol Zero initiation was not exactly a crisis in the familiar sense, which was part of what made it so disorienting. The Flight 507 icon went red. The system logged it. Raymond noted it, and the floor continued operating normally for approximately 45 seconds because one red icon on a board of 147 green ones was unusual but not unprecedented. Then Flight 203 inbound from Frankfurt went red. Then Flight 88 eastbound over the Pacific. Then Flight 341 climbing out of Miami. The mechanism was exactly what Zara had engineered it to be, which was in the current circumstances both technically elegant and catastrophic. The Terramax central server having registered a compromise event on the master node, the flagship inaugural flight whose successful operation was meant to validate the entire network, had initiated a digital quarantine automatically revoking the operating certificates of every aircraft running Terramax software until the threat could be assessed and cleared. It was doing what it was designed to do. It was protecting the healthy planes from the potentially infected one. It was logical and it was thorough, and it was at this moment transforming the main board of TerraFly's Operations Center into something that looked like a city being eaten by a virus, one green light at a time, going red. We have a fleet-wide event, the senior dispatcher, a woman named Carla, who had been in the job for 11 years and had handled 2 runway incursions and a decompression event and had never sounded like she did right now, said into her headset. Repeat, we have a fleet-wide event. All Terramax-equipped aircraft are receiving quarantine signals. Raymond was already at the master control station, but there was nothing he could do from there, which was the problem, which was precisely the problem he had been trying to explain to people for 2 hours. Which was that the only fix for a master node compromise on Terramax was a manual reauthorization by the lead architect, and the lead architect was in a holding room at JFK because Blake Harrow had decided she didn't look the part. Jonathan Webb walked into the operations center at 10:17 in the morning wearing a suit that cost more than most of his employees made in a month, and an expression that Raymond had never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has built something very large and is watching the foundations shift. Webb stood in the doorway for approximately 12 seconds. He was very still. He looked at the board. 41 red icons. 42. 43. Raymond Webb said, and his voice was quiet in the way that very powerful men's voices get quiet when they are genuinely frightened and are choosing to express the fear as a question because a question still has an answer, and they need there to be an answer. Tell me what I'm looking at. Raymond turned to face him. We have a cascade lockout across the Terramax fleet, he said. The flagship triggered Protocol 0 at cruising altitude because the system didn't receive key authorization within the window. The central server interpreted that as a hostile event and quarantined the fleet. Webb was quiet for a moment. How do we stop it? Manual reauthorization by the lead architect, Zara Coleman. Direct interface with the central server using her encrypted key and biometric authentication. Then get her on the phone. She's in a holding room at JFK Jonathan. Raymond kept his voice even with some effort. Captain Harrow denied her boarding this morning. He called her a security risk. Security had her removed from the gate. The number on the board had reached 51. 52. Each red icon represented an aircraft currently executing a restricted descent, its throttles locked at 70%, its crew receiving the same screens and the same non-responses to override attempts that Devon Park was dealing with right now over the Atlantic. In the holding room at 52 aircraft worth of chaos away, Zara Coleman was waiting. Webb pulled out his phone. He did not call the police station at JFK. He did not call his legal team or his communications director or the FAA liaison whose number he kept in his contacts for exactly these kinds of situations. He scrolled to a different name entirely, a name he rarely used but which existed in his phone precisely because some problems were above the level of the people who were normally empowered to solve them. He pressed call. Detective Marcus Tran had, in the course of a 23-year career with the Port Authority Police, encountered many things he would not have predicted, and he was a man who had made his peace with the fundamental unpredictability of his profession, so he did not consider himself the sort of person who was easily surprised. And yet, he was on his second cup of coffee, the second cup being at this point more of a philosophical commitment than a source of caffeine. And he was watching the young woman across the table from him with a quality of attention that had been shifting over the past 40 minutes, from the professional assessment of a potential nuisance passenger to something more careful and more uncertain, and he was trying to identify the specific thing about her that was causing the shift. She was very still. That was part of it. Not the stillness of someone who was shocked or shut down, but the stillness of someone whose entire cognitive processing power had been redirected inward away from the external performance of waiting and toward something internal that was happening very fast. She reminded him in some remote way of a chess player he had watched once in Washington Square Park, a woman who sat perfectly motionless between moves while her eyes did something extremely active. Her phone had rung 3 times in the past 20 minutes, and she had taken all 3 calls briefly and quietly, and each time after she hung up she had looked at him in a way that was assessing rather than pleading the way a person looks at a door they are trying to find the right key for. The third call had lasted 40 seconds. After it ended, she set the phone down on the table face up and said, "Detective Tran, how familiar are you with Terrafly Airlines' Terramax system?" "Not very," he said honestly. "That's fair," she said. "The short version is that I built it, and it requires my physical presence on the inaugural flight to complete an authorization sequence, and that authorization window expired approximately 20 minutes ago. And as a result, there are currently somewhere between 40 and 60 commercial aircraft attempting to perform emergency descents over several different countries. The software I designed is doing exactly what I designed it to do, which was to protect the aircraft from hostile takeover. It cannot be stopped remotely. It cannot be stopped by anyone other than me using my encrypted key and my biometric authorization on a direct hardline connection to the central server." Tran looked at her. "The key is in my laptop," she continued, "which is in my bag, which is in your evidence locker. I need my bag. I need a hardline connection to a server, and I need to be somewhere that has both of those things. I believe the JFK control tower has a direct line to Terrafly's central server as part of its emergency coordination infrastructure." Tran put down his coffee. He was saved from having to decide what to do next by the door of the holding room opening with a force that suggested the person on the other side had not slowed down much before reaching it, and the precinct captain walked in with the expression of someone who has just received information that has fundamentally restructured his understanding of the previous 40 minutes, followed by two people in dark suits who had the bearing of federal personnel. Tran the captain said, "Step away. Ms. Coleman." He crossed the room in 4 steps. "I am deeply sorry for the misunderstanding. We've been asked." Zara was already standing. She was already picking up her phone. She looked at Tran with an expression that he would think about for some time. Afterward, it wasn't triumphant, and it wasn't resentful, and it wasn't the expression of someone savoring a vindication. It was the expression of someone who has work to do and is already several steps into it. "My bag," she said to the captain. "Being retrieved now," he said. "There's a vehicle outside and a federal escort to the tower. The FAA has cleared the hardline access." Zara nodded and walked toward the door, and did not look back. Up in Flight 507, the descent had leveled off at 9,800 feet, and the aircraft was holding there with the patience of a system that had no ego and no urgency, and was simply doing what its instructions required until the instructions changed. The throttle levers were locked. The navigation display was showing a holding pattern rather than the North Atlantic track they were supposed to be on. The fuel flow gauge was running at the rate of an aircraft being asked to work harder than its altitude required, burning through reserves at a pace that Devon had calculated with the quiet precision of a man doing math he didn't want to do, gave them approximately 90 minutes before they needed to land somewhere. The cabin was not panicking, not yet, because the flight attendants were professionals, and because the passengers had not been told what was happening, and because 1,000 feet of altitude change feels like turbulence to someone sitting in a leather seat with a glass of champagne, not like a locked throttle. But there were people looking out the windows at the ocean, which was now much closer than it should have been, and Devon could hear over the cockpit audio system the sound of the cabin atmosphere changing, the small uptick of voices, the shift in frequency that preceded real concern. Harrow was not speaking. He had been not speaking for 17 minutes, which was itself a kind of communication, because Harrow had been speaking continuously since Devon had joined this assignment, and the silence was as loud as anything he had ever said. He was sitting in his seat with his hands on the yoke and his eyes on the instruments, and he was flying the aircraft with perfect technical competence, trimming against the restricted thrust, managing the descent rate, doing everything correctly, and Devon could see him doing it and could see what it cost him to do it in these conditions, and did not feel the satisfaction that he had half imagined he might feel. Because there was nothing satisfying about this, and there never had been. Devon Harrow said, finally, "Captain, the fuel." He said it quietly, without inflection, as if discussing the weather. "At current burn rate, 91 minutes of endurance before we need to divert," Devon said. "Nearest suitable field is Shannon in Ireland. We could make it with margin." Harrow nodded. He was quiet for another moment. She knew he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Devon said. "She told me." Another pause. "At the gate, she told me exactly what would happen." "Yes," Devon said again. The silence stretched between them with the particular quality of a silence that contains everything that needs to be said and will not be improved by saying any of it. Harrow looked at the ocean below, and Devon watched Harrow look at the ocean, and both of them understood in the way you understand something that has been true for a while, but has only just become undeniable, that the 30 years of experience and the 4 gold stripes and the gut instinct that was supposed to be a calibrated instrument had in one morning at Gate B-22 of JFK International Airport been worth exactly nothing against the judgment of a 19-year-old woman in a faded hoodie whom Harrow had decided in less time than it takes to draw a breath he could dismiss. Devon looked at his instruments. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the fuel gauge wasn't already saying. Jonathan Webb stood in the operations center with his phone pressed to his ear and spoke for 4 minutes to the governor of New York, and the 4 minutes contained in compressed form a complete account of what had happened at Gate B, 2-2 that morning, and what it had cost, expressed in the language of numbers, because numbers were the language the governor spoke most fluently. The number of aircraft currently in restricted descent, the number of passengers aboard them, the number of minutes remaining before fuel states became critical on the most affected routes, and the number of dollars that was currently leaving Terrafly's market capitalization at a rate that the trading floor was having difficulty tracking because it was moving faster than usual. The governor's response took approximately 90 seconds. In the holding room at JFK, there was no dramatic moment. There was no flood of light, no orchestral swell, no reversal so sudden and complete that it announced itself as such. What there was the holding room door opening more forcefully than it needed to, and the precinct captain walking in with the expression of someone who has recently received information that required a very rapid restructuring of previous assumptions. Detective Tran later told his partner that what he remembered most clearly was not anything that Zara Coleman said in the moment, but the way she stood up, not quickly, not with the energy of someone who had been waiting for a vindication, but slowly, like someone who had been managing their body's fatigue for a long time and was now directing the available energy very precisely toward what needed to happen next. She took her laptop bag from the officer who brought it in. She checked the bag's contents without visible urgency, running her fingers over the laptop's surface in a gesture that looked almost like reassurance, the way you check for something you need to know is still there. She looked at Detective Tron once, and the look contained no anger and no particular satisfaction, which he later decided was the most interesting thing about her, not the skill or the knowledge, both of which were extraordinary, but the complete absence of any interest in having the moment be about anything other than the work that needed doing. The federal escort moved her through JFK's service corridors at a speed that required the agents flanking her to modify their pace to match hers, which was the pace of someone who had already mapped the route in their head and was executing rather than navigating. In the operations center in Dallas, Raymond Okafor watched the incident counter on his screen. 58 affected aircraft, and called Zara's cell phone and got her voicemail because she was already moving, and put the phone down and looked at the main board and waited because there was nothing else to do. The board did not change. The red icons held their positions over their respective coordinates, descending slowly, burning fuel, their crews managing the situation with the competence of trained professionals doing their best in conditions that their training had not covered, because no one had trained for this, because this had not, until this morning, been a possible scenario. In the cockpit of Flight 507, Devon Park heard the ATC controller's voice change register slightly. The controlled tension of someone who has just received information that has altered the picture, and the controller said in a tone that was carefully neutral. Flight 507, be advised, we are working to resolve the situation. Please maintain current flight envelope and standby. Harrow looked at his first officer. Working to resolve, he repeated. Devon nodded. She's coming, Harrow said. It was not a question, but it was not entirely a statement either. It was something between the two. Something that only exists when a man is in the process of understanding something he should have understood before and is still finding the shape of it. I believe so, Devon said. Harrow turned back to the instruments. He made a small adjustment to the trim. He was very precise about it, the precision of someone doing the one thing that remains within their power when everything else is not. The fuel gauge ticked downward, patient and indifferent, the way time works when there is nothing you can do about it. Below the aircraft, the Atlantic waited. The JFK control tower was a concrete pillar, rising 178 feet above the airport's surface, and from the cab at the top, the glass-enclosed workspace where the controllers sat and the radar screens lived and the airspace over one of the world's busiest airports was managed with a concentration that left no room for anything incidental. The view was a perfect 360 of controlled chaos, rendered orderly by expertise, the runways and taxiways and terminal buildings and the constant movement of aircraft being sequenced and vectored and handed off with the smooth, invisible efficiency of a machine that had been refined by decades of practice. The machine was not running smoothly this morning. The police cruiser pulled up to the tower's base at a speed that the driver would not have used if there had been any choice about it, and Zara was out of the back seat before it had fully stopped laptop bag across her chest, hoodie hood down, because she'd pushed it back at some point in the last few minutes without registering it. The federal escort fell into step beside her, and she moved through the security checkpoint and into the elevator, and watched the floor numbers climb with the focused attention of someone counting down rather than up. The elevator doors opened onto the cab, and the noise and light and concentrated urgency of the space hit her all at once. 30 controllers at their stations, the ambient sound of a dozen radio frequencies running in parallel, the main radar display showing the airspace as a complex web of vectors and altitude blocks, with currently an unusual number of tracks behaving in ways that deviated from their filed flight plans in the specific troubling way that the Terramac's restricted envelope produced. The room registered her arrival in a wave heads turning the particular silence that moves through a space when something significant enters it, and she stood for a moment in the elevator doorway taking it in, not because she needed to adjust, but because she needed to identify exactly where she was going and move there directly, without any of the social negotiation that spaces like this sometimes required. Tower Chief Commander Adriana Reyes was at the center of the room, standing rather than sitting, which told Zara something about how long this had been going on and how seriously it was being treated. She was a compact woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a way that suggested it had been in that position for many hours, and she had the expression of someone who has been managing a crisis for long enough that the crisis has begun to feel personal. Reyes looked at Zara. The look lasted approximately 1 second, which was approximately as long as it took Reyes to take in the hoodie, the age, the bag, and the quality of focus that Zara was projecting, and to make her own assessment. "You're," Coleman Reyes said. "Yes," Zara said. "Hard line is over here." Reyes pointed to a terminal in the corner physically separated from the main controller workstations with a thick bundle of Ethernet cables running to it from a conduit in the wall. Direct pipe to Terrafly's central server in Dallas. We use it for emergency coordination with airlines when we need to move faster than the normal channels. She paused. The encryption on it is going to need... I wrote the encryption, Zara said, moving toward the terminal. I know what it needs. She sat down. She unzipped her bag and extracted her laptop and set it on the desk beside the terminal, then picked up the Ethernet cable and held it for a fraction of a second, running her thumb over the connector, the way she always did before a physical connection to a server, an old habit from her first year of coding when she'd learned the hard way that a loose seating could corrupt a data transfer at the worst possible moment. The cable seated. The laptop screen came alive. The room watched. Zara became aware in the peripheral part of her attention that wasn't committed to the screen of 30 people who had been dealing with the consequences of this problem for nearly 2 hours, standing in silence, watching her prepare to address it. She had performed under observation before investor presentations, board reviews, the particular scrutiny of rooms full of people who had been prepared to dismiss her. But this was different because this was not about demonstrating competence to people who doubted it. This was about 61 aircraft and the people inside them, and whatever anyone in this room thought about her was in this moment genuinely irrelevant. She put her hands on the keyboard. Her fingers were trembling. Very slightly, barely visible, the micro-tremor of 54 hours awake and adrenaline withdrawal and the particular physical cost of the morning she'd just had. She looked at her hands for 1 second and registered the trembling and did not try to stop it, because the part of her that did this work wasn't in her hands. It was in the part of her that knew where every line of this code lived and how to move through it. And that part was not trembling. She began to type. The first thing Zara did was not what anyone watching expected her to do, which was to begin immediately addressing the aircraft in distress. Instead, she spent 4 minutes doing nothing visible, or rather doing something that looked like nothing from the outside, which was reading. Pulling up the server's current state, reading the logs tracing the cascade sequence from the moment Protocol 0 had initialized on Flight 507 through to the current state of the fleet, and understanding exactly what the system was doing and why and what she needed to do to change it. The room tried not to communicate its impatience with varying degrees of success. Commander Reyes stood behind Zara at a respectful distance that was closer than it would have been for anyone else because this was her facility and her responsibility. And she was not the sort of person who ceded control of her space without positioning herself to understand what was happening in it. She watched the data scrolling across Zara's screen and understood perhaps a quarter of it, and trusted on the basis of the speed and certainty with which the young woman's eyes moved across it, that the rest was being read and processed at a rate she wasn't going to match. "Talk to me," Reyes said. "What are we looking at? The server didn't just lock the autopilot," Zara said, not looking up, her voice carrying the quality of someone thinking through a problem in real time and allowing the thinking to be audible because it helped. Protocol 0 designated the entire fleet as potentially hostile. The server is now actively managing the aircraft toward landing, not waiting. It's choosing diversion airports based on distance and runway length and weather, and some of those choices are not good ones. There's a 777 over the Pacific that it's currently trying to vector toward an airport with a runway that won't handle its landing weight. A controller across the room made a sound that was not quite a word. "Can you override the individual aircraft?" Reyes asked. "I can't override the server from the outside. That's the point of the architecture. It was designed to be impossible to hack externally because the threat it was designed against was external. I'm going to have to convince it from the inside that the threat event never happened." Zara paused, fingers still moving. "I need to re-authenticate the master node. I need to make the server believe that I am physically present on board Flight 507 and am completing the handshake. But I'm not on Flight 507. I'm here. So I need to create a location ghost spoof the GPS signature of my connection to match the flight's current position and make the server think I'm sitting in seat 1A. Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You're going to hack your own plane." "I'm going to convince my own plane that I'm where I'm supposed to be," Zara said. "It's not a hack. It's more like a letter of apology." The controller, who had been tracking Flight 507's position, looked up from his station. 507's fuel state is getting into the uncomfortable range. If we don't have an altitude and thrust restoration in the next 30 minutes, they're going to have to divert to Shannon." "I know," Zara said. "Give me the 30 minutes. The young controller at the station closest to the hardline terminal had been watching the code on Zara's screen with the intensity of someone who was trying to understand something they were witnessing but didn't have quite enough knowledge to fully parse. And what he was experiencing was something he would describe later as watching someone play an instrument they'd clearly made themselves, not just knowing how to play it, but knowing why every piece of it existed, moving through it with a fluency that was different from skill and was closer to authorship. Zara pulled up the Terramax server architecture from a directory that she navigated from memory without looking at any documentation, with the sureness of someone who knows their own house in the dark. She located the authentication pathway. She began constructing the spoof, not a simple location signal, but a layered verification package that would satisfy every one of the server's authentication requirements. GPS coordinates, matching Flight 507's current position system, timestamps consistent with an in-flight connection. Biometric data drawn from her local security hardware, and the encrypted key signature that could only come from her specific hardware key. The server pushed back. Twice in the first 8 minutes, the authentication package was rejected with error codes that Zara read and diagnosed without pause, modifying the package each time to address the specific rejection reason, rebuilding and resubmitting with the patient efficiency of someone who had anticipated resistance and had responses ready. On the third attempt, the server's authentication protocol began to process rather than immediately reject, and Zara went very still in the way that people go still when they are listening to something that has no sound. The controller tracking flight 507 said quietly, "507's altitude has stopped dropping." Zara didn't look up. She was watching a progress indicator on her screen that was moving across its track at a rate that was nearly imperceptible, unless you were watching it very carefully. "It's accepting the authentication," she said, and her voice was level, and no one in the room who heard it would have known from the voice alone how much was balanced on that bar, moving across the screen, but they could see her face, and the face told them something about what it had cost to get here. The progress bar reached the end of its track. The screen cleared, and in white text on the server's home interface, clean and simple and final, it said Master Node re-authenticated. Lead architect confirmed. Initiating fleet recovery sequence. On the radar screens across the room, the data tags on the affected aircraft began to update. Altitude trends reversed. Speed indicators increased. One by one, the markers that had been holding in their restricted envelopes began to climb. Zara sat back in her chair. She did not cheer or cry or make any sound at all, and the only visible indication of what she was feeling was that she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, her face did something that it had not done all morning, which was to simply be the face of a 19-year-old who has been awake for 54 hours, and who has, against every obstacle that was placed in her way, done what she came to do. Then she opened her eyes and went back to the screen to verify the recovery sequence was running correctly on every affected aircraft, because the work was not finished until it was finished. The Terramax Administrator Override Channel was not a frequency that air traffic controllers used or that most pilots knew existed. It was a direct communication pathway built into the system for exactly the kind of situation that had never been supposed to happen. A channel that bypassed the standard ATC infrastructure and connected directly to the cockpits of Terramax-equipped aircraft via the satellite network. Zara knew it existed because she had built it in. She pulled up the channel on the hardline terminal, and the frequency indicator showed a string of characters that would have meant nothing to anyone in the room who wasn't a Terramax engineer. And she put on the headset that had been sitting on the terminal desk waiting for her, and she opened the channel. The silence that came back through the headset was the silence of a cockpit in a state of controlled distress. The background sound of avionics and ventilation and the distant pressure of engines running below their rated thrust. And Zara recognized it with the specific familiarity of someone who had listened to exactly this audio environment in simulation hundreds of times during system testing. Flight 507. This is Terramax System. Architect Zara Coleman. I have a direct channel on admin override. Do you copy? A pause. Short, but weighted. Then Devon Park's voice and the quality of it told her the whole story of the past 90 minutes in 3 words. We copy, Zara. First Officer Park, what's your current fuel state and altitude holding at 9,800? Fuel state is tight, maybe 60 minutes of endurance left if we can't restore thrust. We've been trying everything. I know, she said. Recovery sequence has been initiated from the server side. The fleet quarantine is lifting. But Flight 507 is the master node and needs a manual cockpit authentication to complete the restore. I can talk you through it. She paused. Is Captain Harrow on frequency? Another pause, slightly longer than the first. I'm here. Harrow's voice was different from the voice that had told her to find the departure area, and weight different from the voice that had performed a belly laugh for the audience at Gate B-22. It was smaller, not broken. Blake Harrow was not a man who broke easily or visibly, but reduced to something that was closer to its actual size, stripped of the performance. Captain Harrow, Zara said, and her voice was professional and even and contained no inflection that could be read as anything other than the voice of an engineer addressing a problem. I need your help completing the cockpit authentication. The recovery sequence I've initiated from the tower will restore your autopilot and engine control, but the final step requires a manual confirmation from the flight deck. Tell me what to do, Harrow said. It was 4 words. They were not an apology, and they were not an acknowledgement of what had happened at the gate, and they were not a concession of anything beyond the immediate practical reality that he needed her expertise, and she had it. But they were also in their smallness, in the complete absence of the authority and certainty that had characterized every word he'd spoken that morning, something that Zara heard and noted and filed away without comment, because the work came first, and had always come first. She walked him through the confirmation sequence, a specific set of manual inputs on the flight management computer that would serve as the cockpit-side handshake and complete the reauthentication loop. The sequence was simple, designed to be executable even by a stressed crew under pressure, and she narrated it step by step in the clear, unhurried cadence of someone who had rehearsed explaining it, because she knew that the scenario in which it needed explaining would not be a calm one. Devon Park executed each step and confirmed. His voice was steady, and the steadiness of it was something she heard clearly. Then she said, Captain Harrow, I need you on the overhead panel for the final step. Circuit breakers, FM1 and NavCom upper left cluster. A brief silence. I have them, Harrow said. On my mark, I need you to pull both simultaneously. The system will perform a final authentication ping. When it completes, your flight controls will be fully restored. She looked at the server status on her screen. The recovery sequence was at 91%. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, mark. The sound that came through the headset from the cockpit was the sharp double click of 2 circuit breakers being pulled, and then a silence that lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then the sound of a cockpit coming back to life. The specific audio signature of screens, reigniting systems, reinitializing the avionics suite, cycling through its restart sequence, which Zara had listened to in simulation so many times that she would have recognized it anywhere. We have control, Devon said, and the 3 words carried more weight than their content. Autopilot is back. Throttle response is nominal. We're climbing. The controller behind Zara said very quietly, 507 is climbing. Altitude 9,900. 10,000. 10.5. On the radar screens, the other aircraft in the recovery sequence were confirming restoration one by one, their data tags updating with the small efficiency of a system that had identified the threat as resolved and was releasing its protections. Zara said, Flight 507, you are cleared to resume your flight plan. Fuel optimization is active. You will arrive at Heathrow with sufficient reserves. Copy that, Devon said. And Zara, on behalf of everyone on this aircraft, thank you. She nodded, which was a gesture Devon couldn't see and which she made anyway. There was a beat of silence on the channel. Then Harrow's voice, smaller than it had been all morning, said Ms. Coleman. Captain. He stopped. The word was a beginning without a continuation. A door opened onto a silence that he didn't know how to fill. The aircraft is under control, he said finally. We are proceeding to London. I know, Zara said. Fly safe, Captain. She reached up and removed the headset and set it on the desk with a quiet precision, and the channel still open carried the ambient sound of Flight 507 resuming its route across the Atlantic, engines restored to cruise thrust altitude, climbing back toward where it was supposed to be. The recovery of the Terrafly fleet took 11 minutes from the moment Zara completed the master node reauthentication to the moment. The last affected aircraft confirmed restoration of normal operations, and every one of those 11 minutes happened in the JFK control tower, with the quality of silence that falls over a room when everyone in it understands they are watching something they will remember. 30 controllers at their stations. Commander Reyes standing behind Zara's left shoulder. The 2 federal escorts near the elevator. The young controller who had tracked Flight 507's altitude all morning, his eyes moving between his radar screen and the counter at the top of Zara's server display that was tracking the number of aircraft still in restricted mode. 61, 54, 41. The counter moved in bursts, not in a smooth progression because the recovery was executing in priority order. The aircraft with the tightest fuel states first, then the ones with the most complex diversion scenarios, then the remainder, and each burst corresponded to a cluster of aircraft whose systems had cleared their authentication checks and had received the all-clear from the central server and had restored themselves to normal operation with the clean, businesslike efficiency of a system that had been doing precisely what it was designed to do all along. 27. 14. 9. On the radar screens, each aircraft's data tag shifted from the amber of a restricted operation to the clean white of normal flight, and the controllers who had been managing those aircraft through the emergency descent and holding sequences were receiving their confirmatory messages and logging the restorations, and in some cases simply sitting back in their chairs for one moment with the specific quality of physical release that comes after sustained tension. 4. 2. 1. The final aircraft, A767, on a domestic route out of Denver that had been the last to trigger and was therefore the last to clear, updated its tag at 12:04 in the afternoon, and the counter at the top of Zara's screen reached 0, and she looked at it for 1 second, and then ran a final verification scan across the fleet data, checking each aircraft's status individually, with the thoroughness of someone who has learned not to trust a summary when she can check the details. The check took 4 minutes. The room waited. Then she closed the scan window, and she logged out of the server connection, and she unplugged the Ethernet cable and coiled it and placed it back on the desk with the same precision she'd used to pick it up, and she put her laptop back in its bag and zipped it closed. She stood up. Adriana Reyes put a hand on her shoulder. And it was not the hand of someone offering congratulations. It was the hand of someone who had stood in the same room and watched the same problem and understood what it had taken to solve it and wanted to communicate that understanding without requiring it to be put into words, because some things lose something in the transition to language. You realize Reyes said that you just saved the airline. I fixed what was broken, Zara said. I should have been on the plane. Yes, Reyes said. You should have. The young controller who had been tracking Flight 507 all morning was looking at his radar screen watching the 787's track curving back toward the transatlantic route. The altitude climbing back through cruise level, the speed indicators showing cruise thrust restored the whole beautiful geometry of a flight plan being executed correctly. And his expression was the expression of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is now cautiously not. He looked at Zara. She was still standing at the terminal bag over her shoulder, looking at nothing in particular with the slightly unfocused gaze of someone running a final mental check. How did you know it would work? He asked. The ghost authentication. How did you know the server would accept it? Zara looked at him. Because I wrote the server, she said. I know where every door is. I know what every lock responds to. I designed it to be unbreakable from the outside, and I was on the outside. She adjusted her bag strap. That's why I needed to be on the plane. She looked around the room one more time at the screens showing 61 aircraft now proceeding normally to their destinations at the controllers, managing the airspace with the restored efficiency of a system no longer fighting itself at Commander Reyes, who was already on the phone with the FAA, and at the terminal where she'd sat for 30 minutes and done the work that had prevented the whole thing from becoming something worse. Then she walked to the elevator. Behind her, someone began to clap one pair of hands, starting slowly, and then another. And then the room was applauding with the unselfconscious relief of people who have been holding their breath for 90 minutes and have been given permission to exhale, and the sound followed Zara into the elevator, and she stood in it with her bag and her hoodie and her 54 hours of exhaustion and listened to it until the doors closed. She did not smile precisely, but something in her face which had been very controlled all morning released slightly in the way a face releases when it is finally alone, and she leaned back against the elevator wall and closed her eyes. And for the 11 seconds it took to descend to the lobby level, she was simply 19 years old and very tired, and very far from Englewood and still somehow exactly where she had always been pointed. The admin override channel was still technically open when Zara came back to the terminal to log a formal closure, and Commander Reyes pointed it out to her from across the room. "You've still got 507 on frequency." And Zara sat back down and put the headset on one last time. She could hear the cockpit ambient sound of a flight in normal cruise, the smooth, low register of engines at proper thrust, the small sounds of a crew working at the routine tasks of a long transatlantic leg, the particular quality of tension, absent the difference between a cockpit under stress and a cockpit doing its job. Reyes, standing nearby, said quietly, "Is there anything you want to say to him?" Zara held the transmit button without pressing it for a moment, which was a moment long enough to have contained a great many things. Anger or grief, or the particular satisfaction of being right in a way that was also sad. Or any of the words she might have said to a man who had looked at her that morning and decided in the time it takes to dismiss a thought that she was a problem to be removed rather than a person to be heard. She pressed the button. "Flight 507. This is Coleman on admin override. Fleet recovery is confirmed complete. All aircraft restored to normal operations. Your fuel optimization system is functioning within expected parameters. You'll reach Heathrow with comfortable reserves. Admin channel closing now." She paused for one beat. "Good flight, Captain." She released the button. Reyes looked at her. That's all. Zara took the headset off and set it down. That's all. Through the tower's windows, the tarmac below was running its normal operations aircraft, taxiing and pushing back and being marshaled to gates with the practiced choreography of a system that had resumed its ordinary functions. And she watched it for a moment with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she had built or repaired, checking without being obvious about it the way you test a thing you've fixed to confirm it's fixed. It was fixed. She stood up, shouldered her bag, and looked at Reyes. "I'm going to need to find a hotel," she said. "My flight was canceled." The laugh that moved through the tower cab was the laugh of people who had been holding a great deal for a long time and had been given something small and human to release it on, and it was warm and genuine and a little ragged at the edges, in the way laughter is when it comes out of relief rather than amusement. And Zara allowed herself one small, quiet version of the same thing before she walked back to the elevator and went down. Flight 507 touched down at London Heathrow at 9:47 in the evening local time, 5 hours and 12 minutes late, and the jet bridge that was waiting for it had more people standing in it than a routine arrival typically warranted. Blake Harrow knew before he even pulled the thrust levers to idle on the runway rollout that the extra people in the jet bridge were not there to welcome the inaugural Terrafly 507. He had been flying long enough to understand the difference between an arrival and a reception, and what was waiting at the end of that jet bridge was the latter. He shut down the engines with the same sequence he had used 10,000 times before fuel levers hydraulics. The small, familiar liturgy of powering down a machine that would not fly again until the next crew prepared it, and he did it with the same precision he always brought to the task, because precision was something he still had and would always have, regardless of what happened beyond the cockpit door. Devon Park completed the shutdown checklist without speaking, and without looking at him. And when it was done, they sat in the quiet of a powered-down cockpit for approximately 15 seconds, and what passed between them in those 15 seconds had no words, because words were not what was needed. Then Devon gathered his bag and stood. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Harrow put on his uniform jacket and picked up his flight bag and put his hat on and walked out of the cockpit with his back straight and his chin level, because he was not a man who had ever walked toward anything with less than his full stature. And this was not the day to start. The VP of Terrafly European Operations was a woman named Claire Ashworth, and she was standing at the front of the jet bridge with 2 British police officers on her right and a company legal representative on her left, and her expression had the specific quality of someone performing a necessary task that they do not enjoy. "Captain Harrow," she said, "I need to ask you to surrender your badge and security credentials. Terrafly is placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into this morning's events. The investigation will address both the discrimination complaint and the safety implications of the decision made at Gate B22. She paused. "I'm sorry it's here. It should have been handled before you boarded." Harrow looked at the badge in her hand for a moment. The Terrafly wings, the captain's designation 30 years of what it represented. And then he looked at Devon, who was standing at a slight distance and who met his eyes with an expression that was neither triumph nor pity, but something in the complex territory between accountability and grief, the expression of a man who had been a witness to something and was living with the full weight of what that meant. Harrow unclipped the badge from his jacket. He held it for one more second. Then he placed it in Claire Ashworth's hand, and as he did, his uniform hat, which he had worn with pride and worn well, which had represented something he had genuinely earned, slipped from under his arm where he'd tucked it and fell to the floor of the jet bridge, and he stood for a moment looking at it. And then he did not pick it up, and he walked past the police officers and the legal representative and down the jet bridge corridor toward whatever came next. Devon Park watched him go. Then Devon bent down and picked up the hat and held it for a moment, thinking about 30 years and 4 gold stripes, and what experience is worth and what it isn't worth, and the things you tell yourself that turn out not to be true. And then he placed the hat on a nearby shelf carefully, and without ceremony, because it deserved to be placed rather than dropped, even now. He picked up his own bag and walked out into London. 6 months later, the Global Aviation Summit in Geneva put the name Zara Coleman on a stage for the first time, and the name was followed by a title that Terrafly's board had created specifically because the existing titles in their organizational chart didn't quite capture what they had hired her to be. Chief Technology Officer, Terrafly Airlines, and Principal Architect, Next Generation Fleet Systems. She was the MC, noted the youngest person ever to hold a C-suite position at a major commercial airline by a margin of 11 years. She walked out onto the stage wearing a blazer that she'd bought specifically for the occasion, dark and well-fitted over the Caltech hoodie that had spent a memorable morning at Gate B22 of JFK International Airport. The hoodie was faded and the logo was a ghost, and she had considered not wearing it, and then had decided that she was done making decisions about her appearance based on what they communicated to people who were going to reach the wrong conclusion regardless. The applause was long. She stood in it for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who was still learning how to receive things, and then she moved to the podium. She had 300 words of formal introduction written on her notes, describing Terramax, describing the fleet integration, describing the technical roadmap for the next generation of aviation software. She looked at the notes for a moment. Then she folded them and set them aside. "I want to tell you about a view," she said. The view from a corner apartment in Englewood, Chicago, where if you looked out the right window at the right angle, you could see not a plane exactly, but the contrail of one, a white line drawn across the sky by something that had already gone past. She paused. "I used to watch those lines from the kitchen table while I was doing my homework, and I used to think about the fact that someone was up there, that someone had figured out how to get up there, and that it was a problem that had been solved, and if it could be solved once it could be extended, improved, made better. Problems that have been solved can always be made better, In the front row, in a seat she had been shown to by a Terrafly representative who had been very careful about it. Diane. Coleman sat with her hands folded in her lap with a pressure that was doing the work of keeping her face composed, and she was watching her daughter at the podium with the expression of someone who is seeing something she always believed in and is experiencing for the first time the relief of having been right. Zara did not look at her mother while she spoke, because she knew if she looked, she would not be able to continue, and the speech needed to continue. And her mother had not worked 30 years of night shifts and written small stars in red ink in the margins of her daughter's homework so that her daughter could cry at a podium in Geneva before she got to the important part. She kept her eyes on the room. She spoke about engineering and equity, and about the gap between who gets to build things and who gets to use them, and about what that gap costs everyone, not just the people left outside it. She spoke about software not as technology, but as a way of thinking, a way of solving problems, and about how the most important resource in any field was never the equipment or the capital, but the quality of the minds brought to bear on the questions that mattered. She did not mention Blake Harrow's name. She did not mention Gate B22 or the holding room at JFK, or the hours she had spent in the tower, bringing 61 aircraft home. Those things were part of her biography, and they were true, and they had cost something, and they were not the point. The point was what she had built, and who had built it, and where she had come from to get there, and none of that required a villain in the telling. It just required the truth. A year after the morning at Gate B22. Blake Harrow sat in a small office in a freight logistics facility outside Columbus, Ohio, where he had been employed for 4 months as a ground operations consultant, a position that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with the fact that a man with 30,000 hours of heavy jet experience was still useful in certain contexts, just not in the contexts he had spent 3 decades believing were his by right. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November. The window of his office looked out onto a ramp where small turboprops were being loaded with auto parts and industrial components for overnight delivery runs, and the sky over the ramp was the flat gray of a Midwestern winter, and one of the aircraft was lining up on the taxiway, a young pilot visible through the cockpit window running through his pre-takeoff checks with the focused deliberation of someone at an early point in a career that was just beginning. The pilot ran up his engines and taxied into position and rolled, and Harrow watched the small aircraft accelerate and lift the nose rising with the clean inevitability of physics and disappear into the gray sky. On the wall-mounted television in the break room across the hall, a segment was running on an aviation industry news program, and the name on the lower third graphic was one he had been seeing frequently over the past 6 months. Zara Coleman, CTO, Terrafly Airline's next-gen fleet. Architecture expansion. He could hear the audio faintly, her voice even and precise, and carrying the specific quality of someone who knows exactly what they know. And he turned away from the window and sat down at his desk and opened the document he had been working on, which was a ground operations safety manual that he was genuinely good at writing and which would genuinely help the people who flew these routes. He worked, at the same time in her office on the executive floor of Terrafly's New York headquarters. Zara Coleman was sitting at a desk positioned in front of a window that looked out over JFK's runways, and she was doing what she did most evenings, which was to work. On her desk beside the laptop was a piece of paper that had arrived in the morning mail, a drawing executed in bright marker on lined notebook paper by a child whose name, written in careful printing at the bottom, was Maya, age 9, Englewood, Chicago. The drawing showed an airplane. Beside the airplane, in careful printing, it said, "When I grow up, I want to build planes like Zara." Zara picked up the drawing and looked at it for a moment. Out on the tarmac, a Terrafly 787 was beginning its takeoff roll. The engines building to that specific sound, the nose lifting the whole enormous weight of the thing becoming improbably and completely airborne. She watched it climb until it was a shape against the evening sky, and then until it was a light, and then until it was gone. And she smiled not the small, controlled smile of a professional in a public space, but something fuller and quieter, the smile of someone who has paid a real price for something real and has arrived somewhere true. She set the drawing down carefully and turned back to her work, and the Terramax fleet ran silently overhead, carrying its thousands of passengers toward their thousands of destinations, the software humming invisibly inside the machines it had been built to serve, doing what it was designed to do by the girl from Englewood who had looked up at the sky from a kitchen table and decided without anyone's permission that the problem was solvable. It was. If this story moved you, please like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the most powerful thing in any room is often the person everyone underestimated. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one.